Okay, first one didn't record, but that's okay. Gives me a little time to write a little more formalized thing. So this is my second practice doing a little bit of one of these little history lectures while I whittle. I am not a good whittler. I am mostly just practicing and doing it for fun. My theme today, insofar as I have one, is going to be focused on a little bit of the later Roman Empire, as much as insofar as I have one, I'm going to be talking about that. But a lot of people talk about the Roman Empire, and it has a lot of its own followers and people who like it. I've always enjoyed it. I've studied it a long time. Obviously, like many people my age, I grew up on movies like Gladiator and things like that. But I'm really going to look at it from a people's perspective and not really focus on like the way Rome sometimes gets talked about, because I think it's not effective to talk about it that way. And I also think it's just not the most creative thing. So last week I was talking a lot about Fritigern and the Tervingi, the first barbarians in the late 370s who are crossing into the Eastern Roman Empire and basically running from Huns, and essentially are initially asking to be mercenaries, or mercenaries fighting for Rome. Even though they are not citizens, and they don't even necessarily want to be citizens, they are mercenaries fighting for Rome. Now, I wanted to talk a little about this and cover a little bit of this. Basically, my general outline is I'm going to do a slow fall of the Roman Empire. My idea is that I'm going to talk about the history of like barbarians living alongside Rome and what Romanization could look like for people today, both in the military and out of it, and how also barbarian societies affected Rome itself and the Roman culture. And then tomorrow or next week, I was going to do a little more of a narrative history of like the sort of Huns, the end of the Roman Empire, sort of that end period. That was going to be kind of my talk, maybe talking about some individual folks who survived it. Now, Rome, when Fritigern and the Goths are asking to cross, they are asking to be what are essentially what we would call foederati, which the best translation is allies. Now, Rome, this is not unusual and had a long precedent. They would know about this, even though they weren't from Rome themselves and probably lived outside the empire. Rome had been using people who were not citizens since its inception, or at least since the Middle Republic. In the Punic Wars, according to rolls, about 2/3 of the Roman Empire, this is long before what we're talking about now, 2/3 of the military on Roman staff would not be Roman citizens. They'd be Etruscans, Ligurians, Gauls, Greeks, Campanians, even Samnites or Bruttii, all these different groups. So that was nothing new. They often have recruiting hotspots as they enter the imperial period. Numidians, what we might call North Africans, Amazigh people, who are the modern day ethnic group. Their ancestors are sometimes referred to as the Numidians. They were commonly light horsemen. Cretan archers were popular. Gallic horsemen, Gallic being Celtic speakers from France, Switzerland, or Belgium, they were commonly used. This is the early centuries, and a lot of Germanic soldiers. These people would be called auxiliaries. Now, they were treated a little bit different. They had different rights. They often served under Roman officers, which was kind of a problem, as we'll see in a minute. But they served for a long time, and many would get their citizenship at the end. That was kind of the deal. You do this for 20 years. I forget the exact term off the top of my head. Someone can correct me if they'd like. But then eventually, you become a Roman citizen. The idea is this is actually a way of Romanizing people. It's a soft power thing. Romans were very happy with hard imperial power. In fact, they really enjoyed it. There were many parts of their era where they viewed that as the fundamental way they needed to interact with the world, was violently. But also, they were not afraid, especially later years, of using soft power, of making it benefits, like making elites feel like this was the best way. We can use this with the Batavi. The Batavi were a Germanic group living on the Rhine, who were such a common recruiting hub for Romans that they actually became in the first century CE the name of a legion, the Batavi. They were basically the entire society, according to Nico Roymans, existed as a fringe of Rome. Like they existed in relationship to Rome. Sometimes auxiliary societies that are serving under the British Empire are used as examples. which I don't know if it's the perfect fit, but it's a fit people use. Now, over time, Roman citizenship expands. So a lot of these auxiliaries initially live within the empire. They are just not citizens. Now, citizens have certain rights. Roman citizens are people who have certain rights, including voting. They can hold elected magistrates. But for a long time, it's pretty closed, or at least somewhat closed. Romans don't let everyone do it. I mean, for God's sakes, up until the life of Julius Caesar, there were still Italians who weren't Roman citizens. But over time, that becomes less amenable for a lot of different reasons. People are getting Romanized. The Roman Empire is changing. It is no longer just an Italian project, an Italian operation, which is part of the problem when people talk about like the decline of Rome, or they're shopping themselves out to barbarians. Some of that's true, but also they're just changing. The culture of the empire is changing. It's no longer this Mediterranean Iron Age Italian project. That's not what it is anymore. So, 212. Everyone living within the empire is made a citizen. Now, this is mostly made for tax purposes, but it does have a long-lasting impact. SPQR, Mary Beard's SPQR talks about this. Caracalla did this. Now, at this point, there is also being a de-emphasis on military service for Romans themselves. Roman citizens for a long time, to hold an office, you had to serve 10 years in the military. This was in the Republican era. And it was unusual if that didn't happen. But over time, for a lot of different reasons, Roman elites go from being military elites and viewing their power militarily to being civic elites and finding that to be more important. When we mention St. Patrick to talk about a 5th century example from Britain, he mentions his father being a decurion. The decurion is an elite. It's always a local elite. In older times, the decurion was a military role. In this time, it was a civic role. And that's kind of telling us a little about how this has shifted. Patrick does not see himself as a man who would serve in the military. Even in a more militarized zone like Britain, which we'll get to at one point, I plan to do a ton of stuff on late Roman Britain and early medieval Britain, because I love it. Now, so they start shopping out more and more to other what they refer to as barbarian groups, which at the same time are kind of coalescing to more comprehensive states. When the Romans first encountered Germanic tribes during the era of the early imperial expansion, they are tribal. Many of them are semi-nomadic. They are not super complex economic societies. They basically are not able to state build at any level for long periods of time. Some dynamic leaders like Arminius are able to hold them together for a little bit, but never long. That starts to change in the 3rd and 4th centuries. We see these societies, the ones bordering them, the Roman Empire, the Franks, the Goths, the Cherusci, the Alemanni, they are economically benefiting from their existence alongside Rome, and they are able to impose more of their will on the societies outside of them. And with that, these groups do view themselves in a military complex. Their elites are fundamentally military. That is a fundamental element of who they are. And we need to look a little further than Fritigern. Now, in fact, he was considered a warrior king. Even as a refugee, he was considered a warrior king. So, over the course of the 4th century, these people start becoming more and more elements of the army, and it becomes more blended. Eventually, it becomes a thing that to be Roman, to be in the military, is to be barbarian. Barbarian soldiers dress a certain way. They dress like barbarians. They wear trousers. They wear all these things. It's a way of saying it. It became a shorthand. Whether or not a fair one, we'll talk about in a sec, but it becomes a shorthand. To be a barbarian, to be a soldier is to be a barbarian. Now, in some parts of the empire, that's a little less true. Gaul has a little bit more of a militarized elite, as we'll talk about Syagrius if we have time. So does the area in the Danube corridor and Pannonia. Pannonia being what is now modern-day Hungary. Those groups tend to be a little more militarized. Some of the last within the empire Roman military leaders are from there. Now, let's talk a little bit about these foederati. Now, I'll start with the Goths. The Goths had been, as I talked about, previously been soldiers and emperors, soldiers and mercenaries for the Romans. But more and more, they're able to dictate terms. After Fritigern's victory in 378 at Adrianople, they are eventually somewhat defeated, but the Romans kind of have to patch together something. So they elect this military emperor, Theodosius. Theodosius is from Spain, and he is probably like one of the most successful kind of late stage Roman emperors, one of the last ones who's really able to impose his will in a lot of ways. And he also passes laws known as the Theodosian Codes, which are quite famous. He defeats the Gothic tribes eventually, but they're still around, and they hang around, and they keep being brought in. We already talked last week about Alaric, and how Alaric was brought in as sort of and he would rebel when he didn't get what he wanted. He would rebel, and that's how the first sacking of Rome happened. Eventually, these barbarians are even settled on Roman land. In 418, Aetius settles the Visigoths in southern France, in the area that is Aquitaine, the Aquitaine. They are semi-independent functioning areas within the Roman Empire. And this becomes more and more common. These foederati are receiving land, and they are semi-independent. They have their own kings and leaders that are not Romans. And they might swear to the Romans, but the Romans can't really do much about it, particularly at an empire-wide level. There are still very much Roman elites. We will talk about them in the local areas, and they have deep impacts on the areas around them, but things change. Now seems like a good time to mention the Huns. Most of the barbarians I've mentioned are Germanic speakers. Now, that does not mean they think of themselves as similar. A Frank and a Goth have nothing in common and, in fact, often hate each other. And even people within these ethnic alliances don't really necessarily have a lot of kinship, or at least don't have it yet. If you go to a guy who the Romans might call a Frank in the middle of the 4th century, he probably doesn't refer to himself as a Frank. That probably doesn't mean much to him except what the Romans call him. Instead, he probably thinks of himself as his local area, or from a lineage, or religion, or something else. Like, their ethnicity is a tricky moving target, always is, especially in the ancient world. And people don't always how they view themselves can really shift a lot no matter what. But Romans have a tendency to apply ethnic groups to people that don't mean much, though they start to, as we'll see with the Goths. Now, most of these were Germanic speakers. They had been in contact with the Romans for a decent amount of time. The Romans had known who the Goths were at least since the 3rd century, maybe longer. And Franks were a collection, from what we can tell, a confederation of tribes that the Romans were aware of for a long time. These were groups that the Romans were kind of aware of, even if their relationships with them shifted. The Huns come from Central Asia. They are known as very terrifying. They are a rush of what we might call steppe warriors, a thing that will become more and more common as the Middle Ages goes on. The eruption of steppe warriors out of the steppe into other more sedentary areas, South Asia, China, Eastern Europe. That will become more and more common. But the Huns, from what I remember, I believe the Huns are Turkic speakers. I might be wrong on that. If I'm wrong on that, someone can correct me. But they were definitely Central Asian. And the Huns kind of get this reputation because while no one often likes barbarians, there's most people who study the Roman Empire are of European descent. And they have this way of talking of, and even if they're not huge fans of the barbarians themselves, most of the barbarians are their ancestors, a hell of a lot more than they're anyone else's. Like Franks are the ancestors, at least partially culturally, of the modern French. Saxons are the cultural and really ethnic, and to some extent, genetic ancestors of modern English people and things like that. So there's sort of almost like kid gloves put to them because they're the ancestors of the people writing these our histories in the 19th, 20th, even 21st century. The Huns generally, Hungary gets its name from the Huns. But in the English-speaking world that I've seen, the Huns are often othered in a way other barbarians aren't. Some of this is they were very culturally different. They came from different places. like the Sarmatians, like the what are called the Alans, who are Iranian speakers, who would come during this period. But also, it is just plumb Eurocentrism, like, for lack of a better word, racism. I mean, you see as late as the dawn of World War One, Kaiser Wilhelm is talking about the Russians like they're the Hun. He is referring to them that way. And then obviously the British and Europeans take on the Hun to describe them. So the Huns are always kind of get this bad reputation. And a lot of that has to do with, modern day racism. When we study history, we are studying in the context of our own society. We cannot divorce ourselves. We have to remember that we're doing that. Now, the Huns also served as mercenaries in Rome for a long time. The Romans are very well aware of them in the early 5th century, and they served to help defeat Radagaisus, who was a pagan Goth who invaded in 405, I believe. I believe Uldan was the name of the Hunnish king then. I might be wrong. I believe it's Uldan, though. They served under Stilicho, who was a half Roman, half Germanic general, who was probably one of the most important men in the Western Empire at the time. And even some were hostages, including a young Attila. Now, Attila the Hun has a reputation far outsized to his personality. The Huns, by all accounts, were archers. They were nomad archers, picture Genghis Khan, things like that. They were an earlier iteration of that in that same relationship. The other thing they were is they did look unique because Hunnish elites, we have evidence of this, would practice something called skull binding. They would bind the skulls of babies with like linen wraps very tightly so that the skull would shape and look differently. It was a way of doing things. So one of the things you'll see in Ammianus is he'll talk about these guys being like very crazy looking. He uses the word ugly, but he was being a little mean. But some of that might be the extended skulls, which have less to do with this like bigoted interpretation of the evil, Orientalist idea about the Huns, and more to do with the fact these guys had very unique skulls the Romans had never seen before. They also engaged in facial scarring. From what we can tell, they would scar their faces, which is not uncommon in some societies. Facial scarring is a thing that does happen to denote either victories, masculinity, that you're an adult. It can mean a lot of things. Talk to an anthropologist about that one. The Huns also start to build a power base outside the empire. And it's the first time the Romans are contending against a power base in a long time, except for Persia, that they are on more equal than they'd like footing. Even when the Goths are being shopped out to their military, they are able to take a bit of a high hand with them. Adrianople's unusual in that they couldn't do that. And that's partially because those people were desperate. But the Huns start building a power base mostly of Gothic and Germanic people in their empire. And they start building their own settlement outside. And they begin to raid the Roman Empire. Now, raiding of the Roman Empire was not uncommon. Steppe people are always raiding settled people. That is often a fundamental function of their society. It is how their leaders obtain wealth and distribute it to their followers. These are really common. But what is unusual is how consistently Attila is doing this and the scale he's able to launch this at. The scale of his raids are large and they are intense. Now, Attila, we don't know a crazy amount about him. He did not write anything down. The most we get is from one person who goes to visit him in his winter camp one time. We find that Attila is open-handed. He doesn't eat that much except for meat. And he's lives fairly simply. These are Romans talking about steppe people. Steppe people, as a general rule, travel lighter. They have to. Their wealth, if they express in that way, is often measured in movable things. It has to be. Large homes don't mean much to them. They're not even particularly interested in that. But those things continue. Now, I'm about at the end of my time. I've already been talking for about 20 minutes, which I've enjoyed. Next week, I'm going to talk about the Huns as a whole and their relationship with the Roman emperors. That'll give me time to talk about the Roman emperors. But suffice to say that in the early to mid 5th century, the Rome is in a position now where they cannot take such a high hand with the people around them. They are having to fight a lot of rearguard actions, especially in the West. And as we'll talk about, a lot of political instability at the top. This has been a lot of fun. Again, I am Jack Horan. I am a middle school history teacher and adult educator who loves history, especially classical and medieval. Please let me. I'm going to be signing off now. Next week, I'll talk a little about the Roman imperial family as well as Attila.